Standard historical accounts of the French Revolution often center on the plight of the peasantry, the starving masses rising up to reclaim their dignity from a detached, gilded monarchy. Central to this narrative is Marie Antoinette, who supposedly dismissed the hunger of her subjects by telling them to eat cake. In reality, that phrase appears in a book written when the future queen was only 9 years old. It was later attributed to her by revolutionaries to personify the cruelty of the throne. In 1789, the revolution began with a movement to abolish the absolute power of the king. Yet, exactly 10 years later, the same nation welcomed the rise of a military dictator, Napoleon Bonaparte, who wielded more centralized authority than the royals he replaced. While the poor provided the numbers for the uprising, the eventual outcome favored a different group. By 1799, the political and economic restrictions that had frustrated the wealthy middle class for centuries had been dismantled, leaving them in control of the French state. 18th century France was organized into 3 rigid tiers called estates. The first and second estates, the clergy and the nobility, represented a tiny 3% of the population, yet they controlled nearly half the land and paid almost nothing to the treasury. The remaining 97% shouldered the entire financial burden of the kingdom. This massive third estate was not a monolith. While it included millions of starving farmers, it also housed the bourgeoisie, a wealthy class of bankers, merchants, and factory owners. They were the engine of the French economy, but they lacked any legal say in how the country was run. This created a political bottleneck. The bourgeoisie held the money, but the king held the power, claiming a divine right to rule inherited from absolute monarchs like Louis XIV. To the king, the middle class were simply subjects meant to provide funding. For the bourgeoisie to protect their investments and expand their influence, they needed to strip the king of his monopoly on lawmaking. However, they lacked the physical force required to challenge the royal army. In 1789, a massive national debt and a series of poor harvests pushed the country to a breaking point. When the king refused to reform the tax system, the bourgeoisie representatives broke away, declaring themselves a rogue national assembly. The assembly had legal ideas, but no leverage. As the king began mobilizing troops to suppress the rogue government, the middle-class leaders realized their decrees were meaningless without a way to physically threaten the palace. They found that leverage in the sans-culottes, the desperate, starving workers of Paris. Middle-class rhetoric funneled this urban anger towards specific targets. This mass of citizens stormed the Bastille for weapons and marched on the Palace of Versailles to seize the royal family. Directing the violence of the mob, the assembly forced Louis XVI to accept a new constitution. Within just months, the bourgeoisie used this momentum to legally abolish feudalism and strip the nobility of their centuries-old privileges. The strategy worked. By weaponizing the desperation of the poor, the middle class successfully broke the power of the old guard, but they also demonstrated that the government could be toppled by anyone who controlled the streets. The stability the bourgeoisie hoped for vanished when Louis XVI tried to escape the country to join a counter-revolutionary army. His capture triggered an invasion by neighboring monarchies, who intended to crush the assembly and restore the king's authority by force. Panic in the streets led to total radicalization. The First French Republic was declared, and in January 1793, the blade dropped on Louis XVI. The king's execution ended the middle class's hope for a peaceful transition. A radical faction known as the Jacobins seized the opportunity. Led by Maximilien Robespierre, they bypassed the wealthy moderates by appealing directly to the militant elements of the Paris poor. The Jacobins instituted the Reign of Terror to protect the Republic from internal enemies. While they passed progressive laws, such as the abolition of colonial slavery, they maintained their grip on power through the execution of 40,000 citizens. The middle-class leaders who had sparked the revolution now found themselves hiding or fleeing. The very extremists they had empowered to break the king's power had now turned against them. Robespierre's violence eventually became a liability even to his own supporters. In 1794, the remaining moderate deputies in the government orchestrated a swift counter-coup, sending Robespierre to the guillotine and ending the Jacobin dominance. The high bourgeoisie reclaimed the government and established a new executive body called the Directory. Their first acts were to dismantle the social programs of the radicals and suppress the political influence of the poor. The new government was trapped between two threats: royalists who wanted to bring back the monarchy, and the starving masses who felt betrayed by the middle class. The Directory had no popular support and relied entirely on the military to stay in power. By 1799, the middle class was willing to sacrifice the democratic ideals of the early revolution for a strongman who could guarantee their wealth and property against further internal chaos. General Napoleon Bonaparte was the perfect candidate for this transition. He was a popular war hero with a reputation for efficiency and a demonstrated willingness to fire cannons into civilian mobs to maintain order. In November 1799, Napoleon and his bourgeoisie allies staged a coup that dissolved the Directory. He replaced the multi-member government with a consulate, naming himself the first consul with total authority over the French state. The revolution had come full circle. To escape the volatility of the poor and the threat of the old nobility, the middle class traded their dreams of a parliamentary republic for the stability of a military regime. Despite ending in a dictatorship, the decade of conflict codified the Declaration of the Rights of Man. These principles of legal equality and individual liberty survived Napoleon's reign, providing a permanent framework for modern human rights that no future monarch could fully erase. The decade showed that while the desperate may provide the spark for an uprising, the group with the most strategic leverage and organized force ultimately decides who inherits the future.